Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 8, the final week of the class. Congratulations for making it this far. This has been a challenging one. I typically lose students in this class because I think sometimes students will take the class thinking, I'll just add this on, and they don't really realize that it's a full semester's worth of material in half the time. And then students are working full time and they're taking a full time load. They think, I think I can do one more. And so I usually will lose, maybe a third of the class. I've lost more than half of the class this time, and that's okay. Again, there is wisdom in knowing when there is too much on your plate. And in the weirdness that is these days, this continuing pandemic, it's important that we really look at, our mental and physical well-being and how much work we're taking on. I will say this again. This is the last video from me. I'll try not to make it super long, but we got a couple modules and some materials to cover. But this is not a race, okay? There's no prize for graduating early. Nobody gets anything. I personally, as a father of 3, I always hated the award for the no absences award, because that was like, first of all, those people that won that probably got our kids sick because they would send them to school still sick. But it's like, what does that matter in the big picture, right? There is no that doesn't have any ramification. Whether you graduate at 20, 22, 24, 26, it's not a race. It's about what you learn along the way and how you apply it to your life. And so many people are just like, I got to hurry up. I got to finish this. You don't have to hurry up, and you don't have to finish this. And I know that some of you are like, yeah, whatever, blah, blah, blah. You keep saying this, but some point down the line, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, you'll hit a point and you'll be like, oh my gosh, he was right. And, we hate that. It's a friend of mine once said, that when it comes to teenagers, just remember that there's going to be a time when you're going to have to apologize to your parents, because when you get older and you get through life a little bit more, you realize, oh, I understand now. But we don't know that, and we're in the moment that we're at. So you have made it to this far. Hopefully you watched my announcement from last Monday. Only 6 people replied, I think, that at least last that I looked, which is a little frightening to me. But, most of you got done what you needed to get done, so that's okay. It was really just a reminder about that. So again, here's the week coming up. First of all, this video, got to get it done by noon on Thursday. Same drill as always. I keep the rhythm of the class the same for a reason. You have to get this done to unlock the 2 modules, to then get to the quizzes and all of that, which will then unlock the assignments. Though this week you have 2 modules, so you'll have a quiz at the end of each of those modules. You have your assignments module, and then you have test 3, and with your normal 2 parts like you've been doing. Excuse me. And then you also have one other module that is like a assessment module. It is part of the final. It's going to measure cumulative things that you've learned over the class. They're timed, but there's plenty of time to get these done. If you've been paying attention, if you've been doing what you need to do, you should be fine on these. It's all stuff that you should already know. Just take the time to think about it. And you should be fine, but they do count towards your grade. Okay, so as you go through this class, this week we have 2 modules. I've got somebody calling me, probably our good friend Spam Risk. I'm sure that person calls you all the time as well. So you got 2 modules this week. You have pop and alternative styles, and then you have alienated and back to the roots rock. I think that's how they put it. Yep, that's how the book puts it. And so this is great. This is going to cover this actually makes a nice combination here. Thankfully, it's just the 2 this week, so that should help you. My big recommendation for you is shoot for getting everything done by Saturday, okay? Always put that as your goal, so that 1, if you get it done, you get to enjoy Sunday, and then you're done with the class, period. Over. relax, enjoy your next Sunday as you move into the holidays, and things will be good. Okay? I don't wait till the last minute, because when this class ends, this class ends. So you don't reach out to me and say, hey, I didn't get this turned in on time or that turned in on time. The class ends. So it's done, right? Okay. So one thing that I've probably talked a little bit about, excuse me again, I've talked a little bit about in this class is MTV. Now, I may have alluded to it or talked about it a little bit, but it's really important. It comes in very significantly here. August 1st, 1981 is when MTV went on the air. So 50 years ago. And I sometimes blank and I think, oh, it's 1980, but it's 81. So MTV is a huge game changer, and we've learned about game changers going through this class: the electric guitar, electric amplifiers, microphones. We've learned about people like Elvis and the Beatles. We've learned about producers like Sam Phillips and Phil Spector and George Martin. And so MTV, huge game changer in terms of popular music. And then, going past that, a couple years later, the CD comes out, and then you get to MP3s, and then eventually you'll get to streaming. And so there's all these things that will come up on the scene. But MTV is significant. It changes the game in a very big way. So what happens is there's this thing called cable television. Now, you all grew up in the era of cable television, so you don't even really think that there wasn't anything else. But when I grew up, especially as a little kid, we all had these TVs. There weren't even remotes. If you wanted to change the channel, you had to walk over to the TV and change the channel. There were 3 national networks: CBS, NBC, and ABC. And then there were 4 affiliate stations. So 2, 4, and 7 were the national. The local stations were 5, 9, 11, and 13. And then you had and you had UHF and all that stuff. And then Channel 28. Here I think it's 50 something over there in there with KDOC. But you have PBS, and that's where you would find Sesame Street and all those other things back in the day. And what happened in the late 70s was this thing called cable television comes along. Now, again, going back to the older stuff, with TV. TV was free, right? It was free. I use the air quotes thing because the way that they paid for television was with commercials. So that's how TV was paid for. We didn't have to pay for it. We had an antenna on our roof or an antenna on our TV set, and it would pick it up just like radio did and does. And then we would watch what we wanted to watch. And cable television comes along, and you have to pay for cable television. Now, in the early days of cable television, there was movie channels like HBO, Cinemax. There was a thing called On TV, and those were mostly movies. There was your local community access channel. Every station, every city, every community was required to have one. I think they still are. So you got a lot of cool, weird, funky, poor quality, but interesting stuff there. If you're into new wave music or whatever, look up New Wave Theater and you'll see what I talk about. But there was all sorts of crazy things. Any of you know who knows Wally George? If that name means anything to any of you, was on, I think, KDOC. He was on, or Public Access. And so, or maybe it was. Anyways, I digress. So cable comes out and you have to pay for it. Now, it takes time to travel across the country. So not everybody gets it at the same time. It starts to show up in the late 70s. MTV shows up and it releases August 1st, 1981. And not the entire country had it at that time because not everybody had it. In fact, the book talks about how, I believe it was Duran Duran, when MTV hits in one half of Houston, I think it is, Houston or Dallas, like they're selling tons of records in one half of the city and not in the other. And then they realize it's because half the city has MTV and half the city doesn't. So MTV comes along and it is 24-hour music programming. Now, this is all post your time, but believe it or not, for those first few years, MTV was unbelievable. It was very common to go to a party and MTV would be playing instead of people putting on records and stuff. You didn't know what was coming up next. There was no set programming. The closest radio-wise that you can kind of think of it was like what Jack FM is now, but it was really kind of freeform because they had to play what they had. So you might get an Elvis song, and then you might get a Chuck Berry song, and then you might get something from Led Zeppelin, and then as videos started being made and they started really rushing them out, I mean, it was crazy. It was very much the era of one-hit wonders too. So that's why there's so many one-hit wonders from the 80s, is because of MTV. And when you hit MTV, really what happens is the look, the style, the fashion becomes as important, if not more important, than the songs or the abilities to play. Certainly there were great catchy songs. Some of them that I love, we talked about nostalgia before, and this is really right when I was a junior in high school, I think, about to be when MTV hit. So it made for an amazing time in high school and early college. But if they had the right look and the video was grab people's attention, they would it would often get on MTV. Now here's some unknown secrets, or little known secrets. A lot of those bands back in the day, and this still actually happens today, where the band that you hear, maybe the singer is the same, but it's an entirely different group of people recording it. Now this isn't new. The Beach Boys did this. A lot of other Wrecking Crew artists did this in the early 60s, but that happened in the 80s and it still happens today. A lot of those, especially those hair bands and a lot of the hard rock bands, especially as they were blowing up and coming out so fast, those guitar solos that we know and love, was not uncommon that it was actually recorded by somebody else. And then they would learn how to play it. And same thing happened through here. I may have talked about that last week. So MTV explodes, and music explodes, and videos explode, and artists explode with it. So this chapter starts off talking about, I guess I didn't really talk about hair bands. That was my other class. So we're going to talk about hair bands, about that in a second. And so the book starts off talking about pop, and it talks about Michael Jackson, Prince, and Madonna. And so you're going to learn about them. And I know you think you know all about them, but take the time to learn about them. A couple of things. Michael Jackson, we know from the Jackson 5 when we dealt with the Soul and Motown section, was already a known name, but he ended up going solo, signing with CBS in 1979, and he put out his first record, Off the Wall, and then later put out Thriller, and so he was established already before MTV, as was Prince. Prince was signed at, the stories are 17, I guess he was 17, 18, somewhere in there, when he got signed to Warner Brothers, and he was already establishing his career and had put a couple albums out before MTV ever showed up. And then you learn about Madonna. Madonna is a post-MTV artist. So Madonna, not a great singer, pretty good dancer, certainly a very strong business sense and fashion sense. And so she was absolutely at the right place at the right time because MTV was already existent. She was out in the clubs in New York, whatever. But because MTV was there, that she had the look, she had the way that she used her sexuality and sex as a marketing tool. She was not the first to do it, by the way. I know a lot of people were like, when Lady Gaga earlier on was like, oh, she's so controversial. She was just following the Madonna playbook, which was following the Bette Midler playbook, which was following, others before them, Gypsy Rose Lee. Nothing new, right? Sex sells, always has, always will. And so, but Madonna was different than the other two. They interestingly enough, too, Prince, Michael Jackson, and Madonna were all born in the same year. They were born in 1958. But two of them had their careers established. Now, Michael Jackson is really significant. Obviously, now we look back and he's got this checkered history. We still love the songs. I know people that are like, I can't even listen to Michael Jackson songs anymore. I grew up on the Jackson 5. They were one of my favorites growing up. I saw Michael Jackson perform live. I saw Prince perform live a number of times. Literally like heartbreaking for me when they both died. But Michael Jackson was always like a visionary. And so when MTV came along, he was really at the forefront of pushing music videos. And in fact, two of the artists that really drove that most were Michael Jackson and Peter Gabriel. those two pushed the music video as an art form. And that's how you end up with things like Thriller, and with Peter Gabriel, you end up with videos like Sledgehammer, and they continue to push that, and it really pushed MTV. There was controversy early on in MTV because of the minimal number of black artists that they play, and Michael Jackson really broke those barriers down as well. So you're going to learn about those. You're going to learn about a genre known as New Romanticism, which came out of England. It's also sometimes, not so much here, but over there referred to as Blitz music because it came out of the Blitz Club. And so you're going to learn about that. Again, very fashion-centered, very catchy music, very synonymous with New Wave and MTV. So you'll learn about Culture Club, but also out of this you have Visage and Duran Duran and Ultravox and a lot of bands that came out of this scene. Very synth-oriented, so a lot of synthesizers being used in this kind of music as well. The synthesizer really explodes in the late 70s too, and that's why we hear so much of it in New Wave and in these other genres, because they become more affordable. So, if you go back to Emerson, Lake and Palmer, those synthesizers are $10,000 or $20,000, $30,000. But by the time you get to the late 70s and early 80s, you're getting synthesizers that cost $1,000 or $2,000, much more affordable. And things that you could do with them that made them much easier to play, even for non-keyboardists. So you're going to learn about that. You're going to learn about hair bands. Hair bands was an extenuation or offshoot of metal and hard rock and heavy metal. And so it combined the fashion, things that we learned from the New York Dolls and Kiss. And really, one of the bands that really started to push it early on, if you look at that early Motley Crue stuff, they were really following into that. And then it became a thing where you had Poison and all these bands that I don't even want to know how much Aquanet was used in the 80s, especially by these bands. And I had friends that were kind of in this scene. And then eventually that leads us to Guns N' Roses coming through this whole thing. And a lot of those bands, they made it big. Some were good, some weren't good. But if they had the right look, they would get signed to a contract. They'd make a video. They'd maybe have other, studio musicians record their parts, and then they would learn them and get them out there. And then you're going to learn about alternative rock. And alternative rock is just that. And alternative rock is an always changing thing. So the term New Wave, which was a catch-all in the late 70s, started to become identified with a sound. And so this term alternative comes up. And basically alternative just means alternative to what's popular. So alternative is always going to change. And there's this DVD, this interview series that I used to show when I had the face-to-face classes. And there's a part where Billy Joe Armstrong's talking about his band, Green Day. And by this point, Green Day's really big. And he's like, yeah, we're no longer alternative. Like, we're popular, therefore we're pop. And Green Day was never really a punk band anyways. I would call them kind of a pop punk band. But even he recognized that, once you become mainstream, once you become popular, then you're not alternative. So back in the late 70s and early 80s, there were bands that maybe at least early on weren't hitting it on MTV. They were mostly getting played on college radio stations. And that was really a scene. This really was the continuation of the indie scene, really, where this established in the late 70s, early 80s, and then of course into the 90s and all of that. And so in here you get bands like the Smiths, U2, REM. Those are examples of bands that were alternative bands. They were alternative to the popular bands. There was something about them, musically, lyrically, whatever, that made them different than. Of course, all of those three bands ended up becoming very popular, mostly still retaining that. Of course, Smiths was pretty short-lived, and then Morrissey went solo. And so you'll learn about that stuff too. And then that takes us into the next chapter, which is Alienated and Back to Roots Rock, which is, again, a lot of this is happening at the same time. And again, remember, nothing exists in a vacuum. Everything's being influenced. So you have punk that's happening, you have new wave that's happening, and you have this little subset known as goth, which is influenced by sort of the darker subjects you know, vampires were you know, all of that stuff, and it wasn't the same as death rock, but and death metal, which you'll learn about in this chapter too. But it tended to focus on the darker sides of life. Really, probably the band most synonymous with goth in the early days was a band called Bauhaus, which was named after an art style in Germany in the early 20th century. I've seen Bauhaus play live; they were phenomenal, and they still sometimes play now and again. And, you know, the song Bela Lugosi's dead. Bela Lugosi was the actor that played Dracula in the 1930s, and really made it famous. Most people didn't know the German film Nosferatu before that. So you have that. The Cure was in the scene, Susie and the Banshees. They came out of that. So that's the goth scene that came out. You have post-punk. Sometimes you'll read articles, they'll talk about post-punk and how it started before punk, which makes no sense because post means after. But post-punk is sort of the continuation of the punk line. And it kind of combines with aspects of garage rock and folk rock. And so you think about the energy, power pop. It's really a lot of it too picks up from power pop, where it's got anger and aggression maybe, or maybe not anger, but it's got the sort of speed and vitality of a lot of punk, but maybe subject matter is different. Maybe it's more melodic. Here you get bands like Husker Du, The Replacements, Fugazi, who comes through by way of Minor Threat. And they lead us into post-punk, which, just if you were to follow that thread through, takes us through to the Pixies, which then takes us through to Nirvana. So Nirvana would not be Nirvana if it weren't for the Pixies, which it wouldn't be if there were not Husker Du, which there would be if there were not the Ramones and the Sex Pistols and Black Flag and X and all of that. So you see how that works? The Nirvana really modeled their sound a lot on the Pixies sound. So much so that Kurt Cobain actually did not want to release the song Smells Like Teen Spirit or put it on Nevermind because he felt that it was just a Pixies ripoff. Thankfully for all of us, he did, and maybe in some ways, thankfully for them, because that's how we all know who they are. Sadly, that fame, as we all know, got to Kurt and ended things a few years later. So that's like post-punk, and then you have industrial rock. Industrial rock was influenced by the energy and the attitudes of punk and goth, but it was also influenced by German electronic music. There's a genre that we don't really study in the class called krautrock, just mostly for time. But you have bands like Can. These are all German bands, hence the term kraut, which really isn't a socially acceptable term. It's got a pretty heavy negative connotation, but that's what the genre is called. And then you get to bands like Kraftwerk. But then in the industrial thing, you'll get, say, Einstürzende Neubauten, who is, I mean, if you ever want to listen to I've got stuff on in the modules. It's pretty crazy. It's pretty intense. I happen to like a lot of it, but it's a very different way of listening to music. It's very noisy, influenced even by, there was a group of Italian artists in the early 20th century known as the Futurists, and they had a guy by the name of Marinetti, and they wrote this futurist manifesto, and they would use engines and metallic objects. And so this is really, again, nothing exists in a vacuum, right? So the industrial folks picked up on that, but it also has a very heavy dance beat to it. So a lot of it's very rhythmically involved, very percussive. And then through Einstürzende Neubauten, Skinny Puppy, Front 242, Ministry, you end up getting to Nine Inch Nails. And, Trent Reznor, that was really his project. He really is, in the beginning, Nine Inch Nails was just him. And so I remember hearing, when Pretty Hate Machine came out, and hearing Head Like a Hole, I still love that song, and Downward Spiral, and there's a lot of stuff. Some of it gets pretty heavy, and of course it's hard when you're, listening to a millionaire. He just, was I don't know if he won. I think maybe he won for the Music for Soul. He did the sort of ethereal stuff in that. Amazing artist for sure. Really, fame took its toll on him with addiction and alcoholism and stuff, and thankfully he's survived. But when you become a multimillionaire, it sort of changes how you complain about the world, right? And then you're going to learn about speed metal and thrash metal and death metal. So when you take punk and you take metal and you bring them together, one offshoot is the hairband thing, but another offshoot, those that were just like, no, we're just going to strip it down, pure energy and speed, and we're not going to worry about the fashion of it and any of that. And that's where you get the big three of Metallica, Megadeth, and Slayer. And they create their own style. Thrash metal comes out of that. Death metal comes out of that. You'll learn about, at least it mentions the book Venom and Cancer, and which, death metal, you can obviously infer what that is. That's pretty dark stuff. I like a lot of hard rock and heavy metal and punk, but I don't go down that path. It's a little too dark for me. But that's just me. And then you're going to learn about rock and roll. You're going to learn about, back to the roots of rock and roll. And rock historians basically say that there are two artists that saved rock and roll and brought it back to the spirit of it from the 50s. One was the Ramones, and the other was Bruce Springsteen. They brought back, the Ramones brought back the chord progressions, the bubblegum pop sound with different types of lyrics, but sometimes right out of that scene. And then Bruce, who he was born actually almost a decade before. We learned that Prince, Madonna, and Michael Jackson were born in 58. Bruce was born in 49. So he was kind of a different era. He was signed in the early 70s, signed actually by the same man, John Hammond Sr., that signed Bob Dylan. Very Bob Dylan influenced, but also very influenced by the Beatles, by rock and roll, by the bar bands. He was born and raised in New Jersey, and he worked his way up, and he wrote and writes and sings about, common folks, the common man, the blue collar workers, even though he is a multi-millionaire now. And he'll joke about the fact that he's made a hugely successful career about working people while he's never actually had an actual working job. Now that's arguable, because if you're working in a bar band, that is tough work. But he brought back, the music of Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Elvis, combined with the Beach Boys and the production of Phil Spector, the Wall of Sound, and it all comes together. And so he was already well known and big, becomes a big artist in 1975 when Born to Run comes out. A few years later, Darkness on the Edge of Town, and then early 80s, MTV, remember, shows up, and then 84, Born in the USA, and he becomes even a bigger superstar, and then continues to write all the way through, and is still writing and performing today, and a great artist. And to me, Bruce is a perfect way to end this class and to encapsulate all of these things that you've learned about with someone that just is writing and playing at this extremely high level. And I include the song The River. The River is one of my favorite songs, and I just take the time to listen to it. Listen to the story that's being told. Think about the river itself. Think about what it represents. Think about how these things apply to your life and my life and our lives. But it's just a really profound song. So that is it. I know this is a long one. Same thing. There's been some questions embedded. There's going to be at least another one or two. I don't know, by the way, as I do these, I drop the questions in after the fact, so that's why I say that. But I usually at least put one in the end that will reference something earlier in the video. So I know it's a long video, almost a half an hour, but all of this is important. You got 2 modules that have a ton of stuff. I hope that you've had a good class. I hope that you've learned good things and that you can figure out ways to expand your worldview, to love those around you, to learn from the past so that we don't continue the mistakes of the future. Have a great holiday. I will do my normal thing, Thursday reminder, Sunday reminder. Keep up on all your work. Do good work. Finish strong. I've enjoyed teaching the class. I hope that you have enjoyed taking it. And take good care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon.